Good morning, happy Tuesday. So today is the 15th anniversary of my father's passing. I didn't know whether to just write something or whether to do a video. And then it came to me, I needed to do the video. Yesterday, I had the honor of doing a podcast with Dr. Sarah Merritt, who has Lifestream Health Center in Maryland, and she does obviously pain management, and she's an anesthesiologist. She is brilliant. I refer all kinds of people to her. She is just amazing. Her whole team is great. And we were talking chronic pain, chronic illness, and how people deal with this. And so it dawned on me this morning as I'm brushing my teeth. So you know it's important if it dawns on you when you're brushing your teeth, about Daddy. So let me tell you a little bit about my dad. There has never been a better man on the face of this earth. People that know him will tell you that. He never met anybody. I'm going to get teary, I'll tell you that right now. He never met anybody he didn't like. And I don't think there's anybody that ever didn't like him. Now, I'm sure there were people that, didn't care for him. He always had a good attitude. He was always the first one to offer to help. Just a genuine good soul. He was vice chairman of the church, vice chairman of the board at the church. He was a deacon. He was an elder. He was a cool guy. He really was. Loved golf, loved his family, loved his job. He was in research and development at Boeing, and he was just a good guy. And he came from very humble beginnings. He was born in just a very, very small farm out in the middle of nowhere in Arkansas in the early 20s. And when he was 3, his mom died of tuberculosis, leaving he and his sister Ann. And by the way, Ann is still alive, God bless her. And Grandpa did what was expected back in the 20s. He went to find a new wife. So he left the kids with his mom and dad. And from what I understand, his dad was a really nice person. His mom was a little special. She had some mental health issues. She wasn't crazy about kids. And I don't know if she had troubles dealing with my dad's natural mother's passing or what, but she did not want to deal with the kids grieving. And my dad was 3, which I think Aunt Ann was like 5, 6 years old. And, you can imagine a 3-year-old just lost their mom. Their dad is going away and staying with the grandparents. You're going to have a 3-year-old crying, wanting mommy, wanting daddy. Where's my mommy? Where's my mommy? And this woman, like I said, she had mental health issues. I'm not making excuses. I am just telling you. She would take my dad. She would put him in the smokehouse, which it was out by the creek, and lock him in it, sun up to sundown. If you're going to cry, you're going to cry out here where nobody can hear you. That is just so abusive. I mean, that is just horrendous. And Aunt Ann would sit on the other side of that wall and talk to Dad and try and keep him company, and they would cry together and they would grieve together, and that's how they dealt with the grief of their mother. That is so horrifically abusive. There just aren't words for that, and that's in my family. And my dad had such a huge soft spot for kids. And yes, Grandpa came back with a lovely woman, Sarah, and Sarah had 3 kids of her own. So it was kind of like the Brady Bunch. Grandpa had Aunt Ann and my dad, Joe. Sarah had Maxine, Aunt Maxie, Rosalie, Uncle Frank, and then Grandpa and Sarah had Uncle Jay and Aunt Patsy. And Aunt Patsy is still with us. Yay. If Aunt Patsy is seeing this, hey. And the cool thing was, to these kids, they were blood. To this day, you cannot tell them that they weren't, because they were. That's how they were raised. They loved each other. They had each other's backs. It was beautiful. It was just amazing to grow up and see this. My mother's family was not that way. They were very austere. They were not close. They had nothing to do with each other. They didn't want anything to do with each other. But Dad's family, it was just amazing to go visit people, and you could the love was just palpable. It was just awesome. So that was my dad. So we're going to fast forward into the 80s, and my dad was a busy man at work. He was in, like I said, research and development at Boeing. He was a chemist, a chemical engineer, brilliant man, a lot of fun, loved to laugh. He had the best laugh. He had blue eyes, and his eyes would just sparkle when he laughed. And played golf. He loved to bowl. Busy guy. Loved doing stuff with Jeff, my son. Yeah, they were tight. He was very close to my brother. He always coached my brother playing ball. My brother played semi-pro ball for a while until he was injured. Dad was very involved in my brother's life and stuff. So that was really good. In the 80s, my dad started to develop health issues. And one day, he had a horrific headache, really, 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 really bad. And we rushed him to the hospital where I was working. And they did a CT and an MRI. Of course, my dad's doctor was on vacation. That's how it always happens. But the doctor filling in was a good friend of mine, Mark Vinzant. I've knew Mark forever. I think very highly of Mark. And my dad was in intensive care. I was in there. Mom was in there. Mark comes in, and he said, "I'm glad y'all are here, Brenda. Don't go away." And he took my dad by the hand, and he said, Mark was very blunt. He doesn't sugarcoat. He just tells it like it is, and you're going to deal with the consequences. It's not the best bedside manner, but that was Mark. He took my dad's hand, and he said, "Joe, you've got a blood clot at the base of your brain. You've got maybe 30 to 90 days. Sorry, buddy. We're going to cut you loose in a couple of days." That was it. That's how he told my dad, "Get ready to die." That was devastating because my dad was such a vibrant person. Okay, that means we're going to retire. That means life is, coming to a screeching halt. That was horrific. That was huge. And I remember the day we brought Dad home, I took Jeff out of school early and brought him home so that we could talk to Jeff about this. And my dad's family started to come in to visit him and get their goodbyes in. And, all the siblings came up to visit Daddy, which was great. But Aunt Ann, his older sister, and her husband, Uncle Joe, came to visit from Texas. And I remember Mom and Aunt Ann were in the house. Dad and Uncle Joe were sitting outside. And we had a beautiful home on, I think it was an acre. And the yard looked like a park. It was beautiful. So they're sitting out back having coffee, of course, because that's what we do. And of course, Dad's still smoking. He and Uncle Joe are sitting out there smoking, drinking coffee. I take out some coffee to him. I said, "Y'all want some coffee?" And Uncle Joe, I love Uncle Joe. He was the best. And he said, "Yeah, we'll take some coffee." And I poured him the coffee, and I turned around. He said, "Hey, gal, leave the pot. You go back in the house." Okay. I did. I don't know what was said between the two of them, but it changed Dad completely. Until that day, Dad literally had a calendar and he was checking the days off. He was counting, it was a countdown to his death. He planned his funeral. He had everything taken care of. And he would just sit in the backyard and drink coffee alone. He wanted to be alone. Because this is big. Being told that you're going to die, that's big. And you have X number of days. So Uncle Joe, the coolest guy ever, said something to him, changed his life. From that point on, it's, "I don't know that. You don't know that. Only the good Lord knows how long I have." Well, he's right. Thank God for Uncle Joe for pointing that out. Of course, other people had said that. It's just Daddy was only going to listen to Uncle Joe. That's fine. And that was in, I want to say 1985-ish. My dad did not die until 2015. He did not die because of that blood clot. My dad died of pulmonary disease, not just because he smoked, but back in the day when he was working at Boeing, they didn't use, when you were working with the chemicals, you didn't use a mask, you didn't use a hood, you didn't use a ventilator, you just did your job. So he inhaled horrible toxins for years and it trashed his lungs. So that just shows you don't have to live your diagnosis. And that's what Dr. Sarah and I were talking about yesterday. You can have your diagnosis or your diagnosis can have you. My dad proved that. Once he came to terms with only God knows, and God's not talking, my dad had a wonderful life. They traveled a little bit. They would go visit family on a regular basis after he retired. They moved, to the Ozarks, which that's what they wanted to do. And being the nurse in the family, my job was to follow them and be there in case they need me. And they did, because my mom developed cancer and I helped look after her. And then he, of course, had his pulmonary issues. But you don't have to live your diagnosis. And Dad played golf as often as he could until he just got to the point he couldn't. He was vibrant, he was happy. Even after they moved, he was still very active in the new church. And I jokingly call the town Hooterville. They did not move to Hooterville, but that's what I jokingly call it. And his family was there. Some people that he knew and grew up with weren't far away. And I'd like to think that he was happy. It's what he wanted. When people have a terminal illness, it's not about us, it's about them. As much as we don't want to lose them, we have to step back and let them do things their way. Everybody wanted Daddy and Mom to stay in Wichita. That's where their kids were. That's where their friends were. That's not what they wanted to do. It wasn't about us, kids. It was about Mom and Dad and what was going to make them happy. When Daddy died, we're fast forwarding again. Well, let me back up. When my mom got sick, he looked out. They had been married 50 years when Mom died. Horribly in love with each other. I mean, they doted on each other. If one was going to the kitchen to get coffee, hey, can I get you anything while I'm up? That was normal. If they went out, they were holding hands. When Mom got to the point she couldn't do self-care, we had, hospice come in, of course. And Angie and everybody in hospice down there were wonderful. They were very dear friends of mine. But Daddy would try and paint her nails. That's love. He would put lotion on her legs and on her hands and do everything he could for her. He would feed her. He did everything. He did not want her in a facility. I'll take care of her. She's my wife. I'll take care of her. He would sit and talk to her in just real soft tones. Mother, what can I do for you? It was just so sweet, but this was my dad. This is just who he was. Losing her devastated him. I think it brought back a lot of the blocked emotions from when he lost his mom. And my dad did not talk about all of that. He shoved it all down. We're talking blocking emotions, which can bring, manifest as physical symptoms. And he started having more health issues, more chest pain and things like that. We got him into a hospice group with grief counseling where he could start expressing and writing things. It did a world of good for him. It changed him. It did. It allowed him to express things safely, and that's what's important, to express it safely. He wasn't one to journal, but he learned to. And he told me, he said, Brenda, this is really good stuff. Yeah, it is. It's really good stuff. He would come over to my house because I love to cook. First words, he'd knock on the door and, come in. The dogs are barking. Hey, what have you got for old Dad? Meaning, because I bake. You got any cinnamon rolls? You got any cookies? You got any homemade bread? And I know there's coffee waiting. And he would come in and spend the day just visiting. And that was nice. Those are really good memories that I have, with him. So when he passed, he had remarried. And when he passed, I was there. He passed in a nursing home. His spouse did not want him passing at home, in their home. So for 24 hours, he went to a nursing home, which broke my heart, but I was there. And I stayed with him the night before, and I couldn't spend the night. They wouldn't let me, but they moved him into his room like at 6, and I stayed until 9. I was back at 6 in the morning with good coffee. And the nursing home down there, bent over backwards. I mean, there's a lot to be said for nursing homes in the U.S. There's some really crappy ones, but there's some great ones. This one was amazing. They were so sweet and kind and tender to him with all of us. They knew what was going on. I got there the next morning, and the charge nurse comes in and introduces herself, and she said, "Miss Brenda, we know what's going on, and we're here for you." And I said, "Well, thank you very much." And she said, "No, you don't understand, girl." She brought in a utility tray, one of those big aluminum carts, and it was 3-tiered. There was coffee, there was sweet tea, because we're in the South now. So there was coffee, there was sweet tea, and there were 2 platters of cookies. That's how it's done. And that was just so sweet. And she pushed that in the cart, and she was teasing Daddy. She said, "Now, Mr. Joe, we don't want you eating all this. You've got to share." And my dad just kind of laughed. And I have told this story every year, and I will continue to do so. So we would take turns sitting with Daddy, and he was coherent. And he's sitting in a recliner, watching the Masters, because we're talking about my dad and golf, and covered up to here with blankets. And he said, "Bryn, hand me the remote." Change the channel, or the volume or something. "Okay, Daddy." I handed him the remote. Everything's good. He said, "Would you get old Dad a Frosty?" I said, "From Wendy's?" "Yeah." I said, "I'll get old Dad a Frosty." So I had somebody go get a Frosty. Now, he had not really eaten in several days, and he knew he was dying. We all knew he was dying. He woofed that down. I would still, to this day, have the ice cream headache from him woofing that down. He liked it. Okay, good deal. And it wasn't long, he said, "Did you get me my shoes?" "Are we going somewhere?" "Yeah." So I got his house shoes, and I slipped his little house shoes on his feet. And it was just a pause. And he was just looking at me. And he said, "I need you to go get the nurse." I knew what was going on. I knew it was time. And I said, "You got you a hot date?" He just smiled, said something like that. Okay. I'm trying not to cry here. And I was trying not to cry then. I get up, I leave the room, and I go get the charge nurse. And I said, "I think it's time." And she said, "Okay." So she and another nurse go in. I'm waiting outside because that's the proper thing to do. And she peeked her head out and she said, "Miss Brenda, you want to come in?" Okay. They had moved Dad from the recliner into a wheelchair. And he took my hand and she said, "It's time." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "We would like you to call time of death." Sorry, that's a big honor in the medical field. It's okay. So I held his hand and I prayed. I prayed for him. Not that he needed it. And I was joking him and I said, "Now, you know, when you get to heaven, you got some splaining to do for Mama because you remarried, you know." And he would just kind of take my hand and shake it, just, you know, that he understood. And he took 3 breaths, and that 3rd breath was his last breath. And we called time of death. But he went out the way he wanted to go out. And that's what counted. That's what mattered. He was watching golf. He had a Frosty from Wendy's. And I was there to hold his hand, with the nurses, of course, as he took his last breath. I like to think his mom came and got him. His siblings. Sorry. My mom. But it was a very beautiful experience. But he had the right to go out the way he wanted to go out. He had already planned his funeral down to the nth detail. It went off without a hitch. Allow people the the blessing of checking out of this world on their own terms. It's not about you. It's about them. As hard as it is to lose a loved one, it's not any easier on them to leave you behind. But it's not about you. It's about them. I didn't want to lose my dad. I had talked to my brother earlier in the day, and at the time he lived in South Carolina. And he said, no, Brand, Dad he's not dying. I'm telling you, he's going to be around for a while. This isn't the end. I said, Don, I'm a nurse. It is the end. Now, I'm telling you, Brand, you're just overreacting. I've been a nurse for how long? I think I know when somebody's dying. So I called my brother. After Daddy died, I stepped out. And I said, Don, Dad's gone. And he said, where are they taking? Back to the hospital? I said, no, he's gone. He's dead. And it just floored my brother. But Dad left the way he wanted to. His loved ones, his sister, Aunt Pat, had just arrived. I think she probably arrived right when he was dying. So she didn't get to tell him goodbye. But he knew that she was on her way. He had loved ones with him. He died on his terms. Everybody deserves that. Every day, I try to make that man proud. Sorry. He loved everybody. He would help anybody, anywhere, anytime. And I'm kind of the same way. I will do what I can to help people, obviously, by what I do with my profession. But you can't allow your diagnosis to label you. Don't live your diagnosis, live your life. Respect the diagnosis. Talk to your doctors. Respect your diagnosis. When I had breast cancer, I respected the fact that I had breast cancer. Absolutely. But I lived my life. I worked a full day. I had to. I lived my life. But I respected, the fact that I had breast cancer. I mean, it was kind of obvious. Respect the diagnosis. Live your life. You can have your diagnosis can have you. And I say all of this with love and thanks for all the life lessons my dad taught me, because obviously he taught me and many other people a lot of life lessons. So I will leave you with that, and I'm sure he's listening.